To speak of the book of Judges, one must first consider the frame. A narrative extending from Genesis through Kings, undoubtedly the Bible's most ambitious attempt to construct Israel's identity in the wake of cultural upheaval and trauma. Its most dominant narrative voice, Deuteronomistic in theme and tone, draws from its inescapable imperial context, insisting on a contractual logic to history. Yhwh is cast as an image of a human suzerain, preoccupied with the fidelity of his vassals, promising protection and blessing in exchange for fealty and tribute, and threatening punishment for disloyalty. Ultimately, Israel's exilic fate is narrativized as the predictable result of covenantal breach, and its future is dependent upon renewed allegiance. While the ancient co-opting of suzerainty treaties hardly mirrors Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment theories of social contract, there are some similarities both in intention and critique that bear noting. Reflections on the idea of social contract, beginning with Socrates and Plato and extending through the writings of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and subsequent political philosophers, have at their core the notion that successful, peaceful, just societies depend upon the willingness of individuals to forfeit certain freedoms to adhere to a social legal system designed to promote the survival and ideally protect the rights of all. Deuteronomy, despite its overbearing theological rhetoric and rigidly dichotomist logic of enforcement, life or death, blessing or curse, is in fact a proposed social contract, driven by issues of justice and survival, and includes all sorts of legislation that limit individual autonomy for the good of the whole. As is now commonly noted, its mosaic narrative voice barely disguises the political agenda of Josianic reform that attempts to deflect economic responsibility away from the monarchy in order to subsidize territorial expansion and communal defenses. Key to the political success of Josiah's enterprise is the promotion of a unified social identity through cultic orthopraxy. Its economic and social vision is aimed at a better, if somewhat monolithic, life for all. Its ultimate failure, exemplified in Josiah's premature death and Judah's defeat by the Babylonians, instead of nullifying the contract, seems to have triggered a doubling down of its logic as the narrative presses on to its ominous conclusion. The onus of failure is not Yhwh or his divine calculus, but the targeted subject, the slippery, all-encompassing you this day, who obviously refused to choose life. This interpolated subject, constructed and hailed by Moses' rhetoric, is, like the Hobbesian man, spoken of and to in homogeneous terms, but in fact is an Israelite male of property whose agency has the capacity to affect others in his social purview. Just as contemporary feminist and race-conscious philosophers have exposed the universal individual in social contract theory to be gendered and historically, culturally, and racially specific, so too this study explores how Yahweh's Deuteronomistic social contract with Israel, once narrativized, fails to account for how the whole of society works or how social history unfolds. For its part, the Book of Judges contributes to the Genesis to Kings master narrative primarily through a formulaic framework that presses the collective character Israel, its leadership, and Yahweh into Deuteronomistic service. supposedly showcasing what happens when the sons of Israel neglect their contractual obligations. The people, in concert, repeatedly do the bad thing. They follow gods other than Yhwh, suffer divine punishment in the form of enemy oppression, cry out in repentance, or at least for help, and are rescued on cue by divinely appointed deliverers who secure rest for the land. The plot plagiarizes itself multiple times, solidifying Israel's identity as an obtuse people whose destiny is to exemplify an uncomplicated, streamlined mechanics of history. The faithful, repentant generations are rewarded with rest. The unfaithful ones suffer violence and exploitation at the hands of their enemies. But as vast scholarship on Judges and the Genesis to Kings corpus has borne witness, this master narrative constricts, chafes, frays at the seams, and ultimately cannot corral either historical reality or the folk traditions it annexes. In the end, we do not have a thoroughly Deuteronomistic history, but what is, in Bakhtinian terms, a hybrid construction that combines within its single utterance multiple belief systems, social consciousnesses, and temporal realities that interrupt, debate, and at times occlude the Deuteronomistic through line. These narrative incongruities have inspired extensive theories of collection and redaction, as well as synchronic studies of how the narrative tensions work to produce meaning. This particular exploration joins a long line of feminist analyses of Judges that have traced a number of counter-coherences involving gendered violence. It also takes as its starting point recent studies informed by trauma theory. The basic assumption here is that the Genesis to Kings narrative, at least in its final form, emerges from a series of communal traumas, particularly the events associated with the destruction of Jerusalem and the ensuing mass deportation. To use the imagery of socio-narratologist Arthur Frank, we have in this hybrid account a case of wounded storytellers piecing back together the narrative rubble left in the wake of catastrophe. Those generating the Deuteronomistic master narrative default to self-blame, a not uncommon strategy for responding to trauma. By accepting blame and projecting blame on the whole people, these storytellers attempt to explain the community's suffering and to control its future behavior. If covenantal breach is the reason for exile, then attending to this lapse can ensure that such an event does not repeat itself. Taking the blame is an assertion of agency, which is far more comforting than contemplating a random universe, divine caprice, or the shame of complete, inescapable vulnerability. Of course, assuming a homogeneous, thoroughly blameworthy community is naive in the extreme. As social psychologist Hilda Lindemann Nelson argues, self-blame is not always a choice, but guilt internalized in response to a projection by others. In our case, the Deuteronomistic master narrative attempts to infiltrate communal consciousness, insisting that suffering is the direct result of moral or social failure. This rationale works only as long as the people are portrayed as the collective universal character who either fulfills or fails to fulfill the social contract. When, however, individual faces, in both a literary and a Levinasian sense, are allowed to emerge, comprehensive, indiscriminate blame loses its capacity to account for suffering. In what follows, we examine a few of the women and children in Judges who elbow their way into the narrative spotlight. Seizing control of the script, they refuse to work for the Deuteronomist's cause. They reject the predetermined plot, along with its contractual substructure, and instead turn their narrative labor toward exposing a more complicated world where human and divine characters are neither predictable nor reliable, where suffering, survival, and well-being have little to do with cultic fidelity, and where the making, breaking, upholding of other kinds of contracts determine the course of human lives. Women and female children are strategic for the master narrative. The taking of foreign brides and the giving of Israel's daughters to foreign men is the first contractual misstep toward apostasy. So had warned Joshua and Moses before him. Implicit here is a dichotomy of sorts. Women as desirable but expendable objects of exchange, and women as subjects with power to shape the religious attitudes and practices of their children, and thus determine the communal future. Foreign women and foreign gods occupy the same moral register in the Deuteronomistic master narrative. Together, they threaten Yahweh's identity, his reputation, his power to control the behavior of his people, even his very existence on the roster of known and revered deities, as is evidenced in the anxious language of Yahweh's being forgotten or abandoned. Implicit here is Yahweh's own woman-like commodification and expendability. At any moment, he might be exchanged for a foreign woman. How odd, then, that the first woman we encounter in Judges is none other than a foreign one. Achsah, daughter of Caleb the Kenizzite, and prospective wife of Othniel the Kenizzite, makes a brief appearance in a catalog of military exploits. Literarily, the traditions about Caleb and company are subsumed under the exploits of Judah. But Caleb is never explicitly identified with the tribe of Judah, and we are reminded that, in genealogical lore, the Kenizzites are descendants of Edom and are numbered among those to be dispossessed by the children of Abraham. What then is a family of Kenizzites doing in a story so eager to wipe out foreigners? A question that takes on more force when we remember that Othniel will become Israel's first deliverer judge. Could it be that Israel's tolerance of foreigners is a matter of convenience, especially if they are willing to take personal risks and perform labors that others are not? Indeed, even willing to lay their lives on the line in combat when others can seemingly get military deferments? The vignette involving Achsah not only signals a finessing of the Deuteronomistic stipulations regarding foreigners, it exposes the contractual nature of everyday life, the mundane deals, promises, and pledges that are more likely to affect actual survival. Achsah's father offers her to anyone who can attack and capture the strategic city of Kiriath Sefer. Othniel meets the challenge, and Achsah becomes his reward, property contractually transferred from one owner to another. But although a contracted commodity, she quickly negotiates her circumstances. When it came time for her to come forth, she persuaded him, or perhaps provoked him, requesting from her father the cultivated field. She dismounted from, or according to Cornelius de Vos, she spit from upon the donkey, and Caleb said, "What is with you?" And she said, "Give me a blessing," or depending on the vowel pointing, "Give me a pool." "For the land of the Negev you have given me," or according to the JPS Tanakh, "For you have given me away as Negev land. Give me springs of water." And Caleb gave her upper springs and lower springs. This is a truncated story, perforated with gaps and rife with ambiguities. But of note here is the assertion of agency within a circumscribed destiny. Now dispatched to, and as if she were, a piece of desert land, Achsah confronts, perhaps even spits upon, her father's commodification of her as a military incentive, and insists on the resources needed to survive in the time of peace, namely arable land and water rights. Her request is critical, especially given that her soldier, deliverer, judge husband is not likely to stay much at home, looking out for his family. Her story is a reminder that behind the scenes of covenant-driven conquest is an agrarian backdrop where families, even foreign ones, must be fed, and that feeding is reliant upon commonplace contractual agreements, not Yahweh's enforcement of the Deuteronomistic covenant. In fact, her insistence on blessing seems an ironic remake of Deuteronomy's mandate to choose this day between life and death, blessing and curse. Achsah does choose life and blessing, not as an acquiescence to Deuteronomistic admonition or in fealty to Yahweh or a divinely contracted patriarch, but as a demand for basic human rights, rights to potable water and food security. One may even wonder if her story is a metaphor of resistance to the entire Deuteronomistic program. Might there be factions in Israel who, like Achsah, spit upon Yahweh's having made them a pawn in a military gambit, and who now insist that Yahweh uphold his contractual obligation to protect and sustain? Achsah's narrative portrait puts other stories about daughters and fathers in sharp relief. Jephthah's daughter also comes to meet her father after he, like Caleb, has also made a war wager. She is no bride, nor will she ever become one, but she is nevertheless a bartering chip for military success, a commodity of exchange passed from one army captain to another. As for Jephthah, he would be what feminist moral philosopher Virginia Held would call the quintessential economic man, the individual who enters into contracts primarily to advance his own personal interests. In keeping with his propensity to negotiate contracts that ensure his personal success, Jephthah promises to Yahweh a burnt offering for victory. For his part, Yahweh plays the silent partner, granting triumph, but otherwise making no response to the contractual terms. Jephthah's vow, like Caleb's, appears to be public, designed to inspire his troops to secure his victory. Indeed, the daughter knows the content of the vow without being told. If she, like Achsah, comes out to confront her father for his thoughtless bargain with another's life, Jephthah, unlike Caleb, refuses to be held accountable for the unintended consequences of his act. When his victim confronts his rash behavior, this judge, in Brett Kavanaugh fashion, gets angry and accusatory. "You have brought me low. You have become my troubler," he blames, as if she were a conspirator, threatening his ambition. Although she negotiates a continuance, she ultimately becomes Yahweh's reward for ensuring Jephthah's victory. Or conversely, her demise is Jephthah's punishment for his reckless vow, self-serving aspirations, and seeming ignorance of Mosaic law that would allow release from such a vow. However one spins the turn of events, the child is a transferable, expendable object, and her death an unintended consequence in a story world dominated by perverse contractual logic. In her case, meeting contractual obligations to Yahweh means choosing death over life. Her chances of survival would have been better if, indeed, she had been given to a foreign man. The same holds true in Judges 19 for the Levite's wife, whose father seemingly upholds his bridal contract with her husband and returns to him his runaway daughter. Even the story ironically suggests that the men of foreign Jebus might have afforded the woman safety, lacking in Israelite Gibeah, or the Levite's own home. The Levite's wife's rape, murder, and dismemberment convey clearly that it is not foreigners who are a threat to well-being, but tribal neighbors and religious leaders who will destroy Israel from within. As Gail Yhwh has pointed out, the woman's dismembered and dispersed body becomes a symbol of the fractured body politic. Her disseminated corpse, the sign of a tribal contract to come to each other's aid. Deuteronomistic justice is nowhere to be found, and even simple retributive justice has lost all sense of balance. While the men of Gibeah suffer punishment for their crime, the collateral damage is massive, and the abusive Levite simply disappears, most likely assigned to another parish. After the civil war, in which all but 600 Benjaminite men are massacred, the other men of Israel swear an oath not to give their daughters in marriage to Benjamin's male remnant. The prohibition that used to apply to foreign alliances now applies to intertribal relationships. This is another contractual agreement. To break the terms would be to incur guilt with both Yahweh and the other patriarchs of Israel. What that means in practical terms is unclear. The contract comes head-to-head with the threat of Benjamin's extinction, a dire outcome for which both Israel and Yahweh seem culpable. And yet, like Jephthah, the Israelite men consider themselves captive to their binding agreement. But rather than face the consequences of either upholding or breaking the oath, they plot a series of evasive maneuvers. First, they massacre the unsuspecting city of Jabesh-Gilead, saving only the city's virgins, who are then trafficked to the men of Benjamin. Then they plot with Benjamin's remnant, instructing them to abduct the girls scheduled to dance at the upcoming cultic festival. Here again, young women are commodities whose lives are forever changed, even destroyed, by the tyranny of contractual thinking. And unlike Achsah, or even Jephthah's daughter, they are given no voice whatsoever in how to navigate their sentence. As David Jansen has forcefully argued, these final stories in Judges display most vividly trauma's disruption of the Deuteronomistic master narrative. Not only does Yhwh fail to save the innocent, he seems complicit in the slaughter of those who seek his guidance, and he turns a blind eye to the assaults upon his own worshippers. As for the men of Israel, they turn on each other, devastate unprotected towns, turn Israelite women into victims of torture, and sanction the abductions and rapes of their own daughters. Fault abounds among the divine and human males, but the suffering that floods these stories falls disproportionately upon the women and children who do nothing to warrant their torment. These stories affect a painful and raw recalibration of the overarching narrative, a narrative repair, according to Lindemann Nelson. For here are faces unwilling to take the blame, screaming their innocence, and facing the ends of their histories, undeserving of their fate. Another subversion to the Deuteronomistic master narrative that features a contract and showcases questions of identity emerges in the story of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. For her daring assassination of the Canaanite general Sisera, the Israelites laud her evasively as the most blessed of tent-dwelling women. But they also acknowledge her as part of the Kenite clan. She is never identified as an Israelite, nor is she labeled the loyal Yahwist that some commentators wish to make her. Rather, she's a migrant Kenite woman who, along with her family, is caught between the warring factions of Israel and Canaan. Her husband, Heber the Kenite, or we might say Joiner the Smith, has a formal alliance with Jabin, king of Hatzor, and is most likely in his seasonal employ, applying his blacksmithing skills to the upkeep of Jabin's massive fleet of iron chariots. When, however, Heber's wife Jael spies Sisera fleeing the battle on foot, she surely realizes that Israel has gained the upper hand. Her husband is conspicuously absent, and she may well wonder if he will ever return. Compromised by her husband's contractual arrangements, her situation leaves few options. She can hide the general and lie to the pursuing Israelites, but if caught, she would no doubt share the general's fate, or worse, as Sisera's mother's anxious musings in chapter 5 ominously suggest. Instead, Jael weighs the odds and does what she must to protect herself and her household. Luring and lulling Sisera to sleep, she transforms her everyday household tools and domestic movements into weapons of penetration and murder. With the same strokes used to pitch a tent, she hammers a tent peg through, according to Fewell and Gunn, Sisera's open mouth. And Jael, wife of Heber, took up a tent peg, and she fixed the mallet, technically and evocatively, the borer, in her hand. She came to him in stealth, and she drove the peg through his parted lips, making it go down into the ground, or, following DeVos, and she spit upon the ground, and he, being unconscious, convulsed and died. While both Israelite and Canaanite masculinities take a profound hit in this story, In the end, Jael's gender-bending daring makes little difference to Israel's struggle. They were destined to win with or without her. Barak, of course, suffers the loss of social capital, but he still leads his troops to victory. The real difference Jael makes is never acknowledged outright. She saves herself and her family from the Israelites themselves who are operating under Yahweh's direction. Perhaps this is a critique that the master narrative cannot fend off in frontal assault. Instead, Jael's choice creates a side-shadowing detour, offering a glimpse of other competing histories, of life in the messy middle between Israel and its enemies, and of the potential dangers that man-made contracts pose to women. Moreover, her story, told twice and in gory detail, both supplements and counters Deuteronomy's xenophobia. It does present a foreign woman of whom Israelite men should be properly wary, especially if they have a propensity to shirk their duty and sleep with their mouths open. However, by showing Jael's determined face, her story complicates the dichotomies of us and them, friends and enemies, good behavior and bad behavior, even male and female identities so crucial to the master narrative. In reality, when survival is at stake, when time is of the essence, when agency is possible and compromise is necessary, waiting for a deity to implement justice may not be the most effective course of action. Samson's story, too, features women whose entanglements with the infamous judge are rife with contractual ironies and gender and ethnic ambiguities. A divine contract is imposed on Samson's mother before he is ever born. Both the woman's fertility and the son's success as Israel's deliverer are dependent upon her maintaining Nazirite practices. And when her husband fears death in the presence of Yahweh's messenger, it is the woman who calmly explains the contractual nature of the Annunciation event. If Yahweh had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted from us the burnt offering or the gift of grain. Moreover, he would not have shown us all these things or taken time to tell us about this. But if Samson's mother feels obligated to fulfill her part of the contract, eschewing intoxicants and sources of impurity for the sake of the greater good, Samson clearly does not. Though a contracted Nazirite destined to advance Israel's deliverance from the Philistines, his social life is centered in Philistine territory, specifically the vineyards of Timnah, the brothels of Gaza, and the Valley of the Grape, where he literally and metaphorically sleeps with the enemy. Prohibited impurities also cause him no qualms, as he eats and shares with his parents contaminated honey foraged from a lion's seasoned carcass, and as he appropriates a jawbone from a donkey's cadaver to bludgeon to death an entire Philistine regiment. For the most part, Yahweh indulges Samson's unbridled whims, animating him with superhuman strength, even as he boasts of his dalliances with impurity. Yahweh overlooks Samson's contractual infractions because, the narrator divulges, Yahweh was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines because the Philistines ruled over Israel. We might assume, as many have, that this narratorial aside indicates Yahweh's concern for Israel's welfare. But we might also see how this bears upon the Deuteronomistic contract. Philistine rule puts the expected exclusive allegiance to Yahweh in jeopardy. As in the case of Jephthah, Yahweh seems willing to tolerate Samson's self-interested motivations when they ultimately serve the larger social contract. But the gendered double standard becomes excruciatingly evident as the narrator parts the curtains to showcase the dilemma of Samson's Timnite bride. Caught in the middle of Samson's contractual wager with his male wedding companions, a wager designed to bring Samson both public admiration and economic gain, the woman is forced by the guests into a contract with deadly consequences. Her life and the lives of her family are held ransom for the answer to Samson's riddle. When her contract with the wedding guests is met, Samson is required to fulfill his, which he does so with excessive violence. We watch as the making and breaking of contracts domino in rapid succession, with the ultimate fiery barrage engulfing the bride and her family. The intentional focalization on the woman's desperation and fate evokes sympathy, not only with her and her family, but with all the women and children who, ensnared within these so-called gentlemen's agreements, end up as casualties in the larger Deuteronomistic contractual program. Delilah, on the other hand, can be seen as an inverted mirror image to Jael, especially if we follow Susan Ackerman's lead and read as a Philistine. If Delilah's machinations had, as Jael's, succeeded in delivering an enemy of Israel into Israelite hands, she would be deemed a hero rather than the villainous femme fatale of tradition. But as a spy under contract by the Philistines, who have already displayed their ruthlessness in their murder of Samson's bride, she has few options. She can either earn a handsome wage by playing chamber games with the Israelite terrorist, in the hopes that a little erotic bondage will uncover his contractual secret, or she can refuse and suffer the consequences. She may be the quintessential foreign woman, but she is hardly a Deuteronomistic stereotype. She does not lead Samson to worship other gods, or in any way threaten his allegiance to Yahweh. Rather, she merely exposes Yahweh's odd notions of leadership and the superficiality and fickleness of Yahweh's commitments. After all his indulgences of Samson's morally questionable impetuosities, in the end, Yahweh abandons him at the first sight of a woman wielding scissors. When taken together, what do these stories do and say? How do they repair the Deuteronomistic master narrative? They explore faces rather than masses. They home in on homes rather than the national landscape. They dramatize how men's wars, however theologically justified, wreak havoc on the lives of women and children. These stories blur the Deuteronomistic line between familiar and foreign, and even provoke empathy for foreign women. They show that the Deuteronomistic covenant is not the only contract with the power over life and death. Indeed, contracts are ubiquitous and necessary in an untrustworthy world, but unintentional consequences abound, and in and of themselves, contracts cannot dictate either success or survival for everyone. In this way, these everyday contracts undermine the credibility of the Deuteronomistic covenant. Not only is Yahweh unable to ensure justice survival and well-being for the innocent, but Yahweh himself, like the daughters of Israel, is revealed to be tradable, expendable, vulnerable. By thickening the narrative tissue of Judges and Genesis to Kings, these stories offer testimonials of communal identity truer than any one depiction. We are not merely sons who follow or fail to follow in our Father's footsteps, they seem to be saying. Rather, we are many. Our faces are not all Israelite, and they are not all male. Our challenges and traumas are manifold, and there is no one master narrative that will account for what has happened to us and for what we may or may not be capable of becoming. The arc of history is not inevitable. It is not even a singular arc, no matter how constrictive the narrative frame.